ACEC is coming to Boston. Join us on April 28th and 29th for our private market symposium on the hot healthcare and science and technology market. If you work for an engineering firm engaged in designing the hospitals, laboratories, and production facilities that power this critical market, this is the event for you. Learn more and register at acec.org. Welcome to Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies. Today, we are taking a close look at the newly updated Engineering Business Sentiment Study for Q1 2022. And to join us in this conversation, we're very pleased to welcome Joe Bates. Anyone who has been at an ACEC event over the past few months and years has seen Joe up on stage, sometimes with Aaron McLaughlin talking about the economy, and sometimes with other people at the Institute talking about the research that they're producing. But Joe and his team have been very hard at work, pivoting from one study to another study to another study, from the COVID-19 business impact studies to other research and from the economic profile and forecasting, and now looking at an updated version of the business sentiment study. And it's a really interesting update. And Joe, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Hi, Jeff. I'm really happy to be here talking with you about the study.
Yeah, this is really interesting because it's something that, especially today, with all the news coming out about the economy, with sustained inflation, about concerns related to what the Fed is going to do, you have this narrative going on about the economy potentially going into the red, and then you have this update, which kind of, again, broadly surveyed 600 executives and kind of did a net rating score on what they feel about their firms, their finances, outlook on hiring, and of course the macro economy. And it paints kind of a very different story. Can you kind of go into how the study was first done and what this net rating system is, and then what the big takeaway is from the update?
Sure. So I conceived of this study with Daphne Bryant, who's the head of the ACEC Research Institute. We wanted to develop a study that would take the pulse of the industry. And so what we're doing is every quarter, we are going out to the leaders of ACEC member firms. Those are people who are VPs and above. And we're asking them about their outlook, current conditions compared to the last 3 months, as well as what they anticipate in the next 12 months. So that's how we conceived of this study. And we wanted to do this so that we could track over time what's happening within our industry. There's a lot of other industries that do similar types of studies. And so we wanted to create this study for the engineering and design services industry. So that's sort of how it came to be. And we have now done the second quarter of this study. And it's really interesting because the first quarter, we learned some new things. It was all new, so we weren't really sure what to make of it, other than, wow, everything looks to be going very well, which was really good news because we have similar types of data points from the COVID research we did, which were painting to a very bleak picture at the beginning of the pandemic and a recovery, but a very uneven recovery, larger firms doing better than smaller firms. So that's kind of where we were. Now, what we're seeing is a divergence of the sort of fortunes of the firms and the industry versus the U.S. economy. And I think it's really easy to understand when you dig a little deeper into the numbers.
So what are the numbers telling you on how optimistic the industry is on the aggregate about where they're going to be, where they are now, and where they look at 12 months forward, where they kind of believe they're going to find themselves?
Right. So right now, firms are very optimistic about their own finances as well as the condition of the industry itself. We're seeing what really can only be described as record levels of optimism. you know, I think it's understandable coming out of the pandemic, the firms have recovered more quickly than what we had anticipated during the pandemic. So there's a lot of good things happening within the industry. It's been very resilient. On
Yeah.
top of
Yeah.
that, you layer the fact that we just saw the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed and enacted. And this is what is fueling the optimism for the industry and for firms over the next year. But we're seeing even more of a divergence with respect to the health of the economy because of inflation,
Yeah.
because people understand that interest rates are going to go up, because of a labor shortage that we're having right now, because of geopolitical tensions. There's a lot of issues that are clouding the US economy. But the good news is that the engineering and design services industry so far has been shielded from those effects.
Yeah, I mean the findings are, and it says it in the report, and it's true. It's staggering. Then you look at the net rating for the outlook for overall firm finances is a plus 88 and plus 82 for the engineering design services industry. I mean that's a massive number. And then you look at firms, of course, with more than 500 employees, and it's even stronger at plus 98 net rating. But even the firms
Right.
that yeah, are not the smaller firms also have a very positive one, but again, like you said, those concerns related to economic stability, international crises, and the like, it's pushing down that sentiment on the outlook for the economy on a macro level. It's about what plus 29 or so. It's like it's gone down.
Right. It's gone down by 11 points for the current sentiment. And if you look ahead 12 months, it's turned negative. And of course, this is only our second
Yeah.
time conducting the study, but it's the first time that we've seen it go negative in the future 12 months. And to just explain a little bit more about the net ratings, you take the positive sentiment and you subtract the negative sentiment from that. There's also neutral. So there's another category. And so when you talk
Hmm.
about a plus 98, you can't go higher than plus 100. That's the top. So
Yeah.
you literally can't get
Yeah.
more optimistic if you're a large firm right now. But as you said, with the US economy, we are just barely treading even at the moment, and it's trending to the negative for sure.
Looking at the regional breakdown of how the firms are reporting out their data, was there anything that stuck out at you? Is there anything that kind of is very different from when you looked at the COVID-19 kind of reporting on regional breakouts? It seems like the Northeast seems to be the most positive. Okay, I can see why that is. Just basically because you have the larger metropolitan areas and you have the 95 corridor and all the build out that's happening there. But anything else stick out at you with that regional breakdown?
Yeah, we're actually seeing a lot of changes under the surface, right? So during the pandemic, the data points we had pointed to a much more difficult time if you were in the West or the Northeast. And a lot of that had to do, with shutdowns, with the extent of shutdowns, the extent of social distancing, et cetera, that different states and different areas of the country were taking. Now, in the first sentiment study, we still saw that hangover. We saw that firms in the Northeast and the West were less optimistic, although still very optimistic, but
Mm.
less so than in the South and the
Yeah.
Midwest. What we're seeing in this second wave in the first quarter of 2022 is a more leveling out of sentiment across the country. So yeah, we saw a big
Hmm.
uptick in the Northeast, but really it's just bringing it in line with the rest of the country. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the story at the regional level right now, is things are sort of evening out across the country. But we're also seeing that same trend when you look at firm sizes. Again, the smaller firms were hurt the hardest during the pandemic. They took the longest to recover, but we're now seeing in this first quarter of 2022 a it's getting much closer. The larger firms are still more optimistic, especially if you look about 12 months into the future, but those smaller firms are catching up, and that I think is a really good and positive
Yeah.
story as well.
It really does show a complete narrative from the beginning research that you did during COVID-19, where, as you mentioned, we saw that unequal recovery. We saw, it was very mixed throughout those months. And while overall together was a positive story that the industry was doing well, yeah, it wasn't across the board even. So it does seem like over time now, as we exit and hopefully we get into endemic period, and we move out of the mandates, we moved out of really this pandemic environment, that we do get this evening of the industry, which it's a good sign. It shows that the industry as a whole is coming out into a more balanced recovery.
We see that all over the place. You can just read the news and you see that things are starting to become more normalized. We're emerging, as you said,
Mhm.
from various restrictions that the pandemic imposed. So we definitely see that within this data.
Yeah. Now looking at sectors, because it looks like there are a couple of sectors that far and away are leading in terms of sentiment. It looks like in the very positive, looking at right now, and then the changeover from the previous quarter, it looks like industrial and manufacturing facilities is very strong, followed by healthcare, commercial real estate, water, wastewater, and then science and technology. Um, and science and technology, that's a growing field. And actually, we're going to be doing a private market symposium up in Boston at the end of April on science, healthcare science and technology, which is perfect place to do it in Boston, right at the doorstep of MIT and the growing biotech industry up there. And, how do you see the sectors panning out here? Is there anything that kind of stood out to you, or I mean, commercial real estate and just real estate in general residential real estate has been driving a lot of industry growth here, year over year, over 20% growth. Anything else kind of stick out as an important kind of change, positive or negative in your mind?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. The first is that when you look at the net ratings by sector, they're overwhelmingly positive. I mean, we do have some sectors that are overperforming and others that are sort of lagging relative to each other, but overall the sentiment is very positive, as it is with the firm's finances and the industry. So not surprising to see that very positive sentiment when you look at the sectors. But what we're seeing in terms
Yeah.
of the stronger sectors are those that really were doing well and holding up well during the pandemic. So, as you mentioned, water and wastewater and healthcare facilities, data centers in particular, those just have been growing for years and years. But sectors that really were booming during the pandemic, we're still seeing those as being the leading sectors. And as you said, residential, land development, that's really hot, and I think it's going to cool off, but it's still at the moment it's really strong. So the laggards,
Yeah.
though, are those areas where people congregate. So when you look at convention centers, sports facilities, that again, it's positive overall, but it's one of the lowest sectors at the moment relative to others. And
Hmm.
so that's kind of what we're seeing at the moment.
So let's take a look at some hot button kind of points with the sentiment study. And I guess the two things are you've got backlog, project backlog, and then you're looking at also the question of hiring, which is always a hot button issue, especially, now with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed. It all comes down to questions of capacity within the engineering industry. What did you find related to backlogs at firms that kind of differed from the last survey done?
Yeah, it really kind of is confirming what we're seeing in the sentiment, right? So far, we're seeing backlog kind of track with sentiment, and so overall, backlog is still is strong. It got down to
Yeah.
less than 6 months during the pandemic, and much less for certain segments of the industry. But right now, we're seeing a really healthy 10 months. So that's positive, right? And we're seeing that hold steady. So that's really good news as well. And firms, by and large, are very positive when we ask them about their anticipated future backlog. So what we're seeing is, again, using that sort of net rating aspect, we're seeing a plus 53 in terms of, I'm sorry, a plus 55. It's up from plus 53 compared to last quarter. So still very, very strong. And when you look underneath the hood a little bit, again, we see that it's sort of leveling out a little bit more in the regions, although the West is still lagging a bit, but it's starting to come back. And we're also seeing those smaller firms have more positive increases in backlog, whereas the larger firms are starting to hold back a little bit more. But the large firms were doing very, very well to begin with. So overall, backlogs are holding up, and again, it's sort of evening out from what we had seen earlier.
Now, on the hiring issue, we find that 90% of respondents in the survey did indicate that their firm had at least one staff opening, which was an increase of 87% from the last quarter. Even though the median number of openings, open positions, is largely unchanged, that number of opening at firms with more than 500 full-time employees, so the larger firms surged from 60 to 80. So it seems as though hiring is still a hot button issue, but then that goes right head to head with inflation, which is also a major concern. Yeah, how what did you find as far as what the firms are thinking about in terms of salary, hiring, and what their outlook is in capacity issues?
Yeah, I, depending on your perspective, it's good news or it's bad news,
Yeah,
right? So
or it's
if you're an
bad news.
employee, yeah, right. If you're an employee, you're like,
Yeah,
hey,
if you're an employee, it's great. If you're, yeah,
yeah. But from the firm perspective, it's a very tight labor market. I mean, as you said, 9 out of 10 firms have at least one open position. And the reason we saw that average go up, but the median stayed the same, was because those larger firms surged. I mean, to have the median go from 60 to 80 among large firms, that's really remarkable. So we are seeing a hiring surge like we've never seen before, and there's a lot of factors playing into that, but people dropped out of the labor force during the pandemic and haven't come back, and that's just added fuel to the fire. Now you put on top of that inflationary concerns. Well, the cost of living is going up, the cost of goods are going up, the cost of raw materials and supplies are going up, and there's a lot of reasons for that as well. And then you layer on top of that, firm salaries on average really jumped last year. We saw a median increase across firms of 5%. Now that's just taking all levels of employment into consideration, but 5%, that's pretty remarkable when before last year, not really this specific industry, but if you look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you were seeing regular increases of about 2.5%, right? So to go to 5% in one year, and then to have a large percentage of firms who reported that their salaries were increasing even higher. We had 12% of firms say that their average increase was 10% or higher. Like that's remarkable. So we're heading into some tough times when it comes to the labor market and inflation. And I think that's why when we ask firms what they think about the impact of the Jobs Act, we're seeing a little bit more of a tempered response there. They're definitely optimistic that it's going to help the grow the economy. It's going to help sustain the industry. But in terms of profitability, firms are much more concerned. They're a little bit more hesitant because of these other factors at play. So, Aaron and I, for instance, we talked early last year that we saw inflation coming. And when the government was saying this is going to be temporary, it's transitory, we were like, it doesn't look like it to us. We were right. It's here. It's here for a little while. And once you start to get a surge of 7% inflation, which is what we saw for the whole of last year, the Fed has to start tightening. It has no choice. And we're in for an interesting year, I think, when it comes to the macro economy.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody's waiting for the Fed to act. And so far, not much has happened. But, it shows in the data. I mean, 73% responded that they are extremely concerned about the impact inflation is going to have on their firm in the coming year. Yes, opportunities will largely 62% report that, the IIJA is going to create more opportunity. But as you said, Joe, that number goes down when it talks about that profitability number, with just 39% of respondents agreeing that the bill is going to increase profitability at their firm. So these larger macroeconomic concerns are really, eating into that sentiment. So we kind of have a tale of two cities here. We've got an industry that looks very optimistic as far as what they consider in terms of their firm finances and how their firms are performing. But then you have this larger looming cloud that's the U.S. economy as a whole. And that's kind of a note to our policymakers in Washington that, what's happening is, what's happening with inflation and the economy is having, an impact on some of our most important sectors of the economy. This is really good information. I think that this is the kind of thing that shows the value of the ACEC Research Institute, especially when you have the first sentiment study, you have that benchmark, and now we can look and we can actually measure against time and events in the world. My understanding is that you're going to have a roundtable on this study coming up very soon in March. Tell us a little bit about that, and what you're looking to get out of that roundtable.
Absolutely. So Aaron and I are going to do a roundtable. It is in March. The publicizing of that will be happening very, very shortly. So, keep your eyes out for emails about that. But what Aaron and I are going to do, we're going to talk about the macroeconomic figures. We're going to update some of the data that our economists produce for us with the forecasts from last year. And then we're going to talk about the sentiment study. And she's going to talk about what she's seeing from the private market data that she tracks. So I think it's going to be a really lively discussion. We're going to go into more details than you and I were able to address here today. And we're going to be able to answer questions from the audience. So this was a very, very popular roundtable when we did our forecast and the first economic sentiment study that we had last year. I'm really expecting we'll have a great attendance this year. And I'm really looking forward to being able to talk about what's going on with the industry, where it's headed, and answer people's questions. And hopefully we'll be okay this year. And I think we're cushioned, by the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, but there's a lot that we have to pay attention to. So everybody needs to stay tuned.
Yeah, go to www.acecresearchinstitute.org to get a copy of this study for free, and also to register for that roundtable, again, complimentary to ACEC members. It's going to be a great informative discussion. And Joe, keep up the great work. I mean, this is exactly the kind of stuff that I think that we had in mind when we thought about the Research Institute, and kind of setting ACEC apart by producing its owned produced research for the industry. And I think for any executive sitting out there wondering about where things are going, reports like this definitely help them plan for the near and long term.
Absolutely. You said it, Jeff, that this is not available anywhere else. This is unique to the ACEC Research Institute. It's something that we have created for the members and for the industry. And it is our hope and our desire that it will help the firms navigate the future. If you have a crystal ball, or even a cloudy crystal ball, as it is sometimes, that's much better than not having a crystal ball at all.
Again, Joe Bates with the ACEC Research Institute, thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to digging into this data into the future for the next sentiment study release. And of course, there's going to be a lot more coming out of the ACEC Research Institute, namely a QBS study, which is going to be also very useful for our firms engaged in public and private sector markets, and then a design build study. There's a lot happening. So stay tuned for more. Until then, this has been Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies. We'll see you next time.